Hi everyone. Happy Thursday. Hope you're doing okay. I just had my live discussion with my class that's meeting online and for which I'm taping all of my lectures, and it's fun to see all the students online in their little boxes like the Brady Bunch, and then they ask questions and I can see them talk, and they're real people, though through Zoom, but it's okay. They had some kick-ass questions, like really good ideas about kingship and power and other stuff. Hey, Marissa. Hey, Nadia. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I wanted to talk about, because so many of you have asked me to talk about pestilence, plague, sickness, epidemics of some kind. And I don't know anything about epidemics, which is why I haven't done it up to now, because what do I know? And so I did some research and looked some things up. And I found a really good article by Ava. Oh, here we go. I'm going to butcher some Greek. Everyone ready? Panagiotakopoulou, I think. I'll send the link. It is published in the Journal of Biogeography. This is dating from 2004, so a bit old, but not horrible. 15 years, big deal. And it collects, it's called Pharaonic Egypt and the Origin of the Plague. And it has a whole like plague rat life cycle and beautiful things that are kind of horrific and include pictures of fleas and rats and scary things. But a good condensation of all of the evidence for epidemics or plague-like things from ancient Egypt. And she points out that the earliest plague, first time the plague is ever mentioned for ancient Egypt, is in the Ebers papyrus, Ebers. It's a medical papyrus, early New Kingdom. And it says, if thou, I'm not going to do the thou, because she gets this from an old translation from the 30s, so we'll go ahead and make this a common you. If you examine a man who suffers from the said disease for hours, like consuming purulency, and he is weak like a breath that passes away, then you shall say it is because of the closing of a collection. These words in medical papyri are not easily translated, so one would have to look each word up. But it produces a raised, they call it a bubo, it produces a pus-filled growth on the body that has petrified, and the disease has hit. And you have to prepare for him remedies to open up these pus-filled things by means of medicines. Yeah. So that's Papyrus Ebers. Then there's Papyrus Hurst, medical papyrus as well. And this one is, who is not, and this has a more of a prayer to it. So many of you were like, well, what do people do when there's an epidemic? How do they feel? How do they control it? How do they deal with it? This gives you a better understanding. Who is knowledgeable like Re being the sun god, who knows the like of this god when the body is blackened with black spots, to arrest the god, stop the god who is above. Just as Seth had banned the Mediterranean Sea, Seth will ban you likewise. So this is your magical incantation. Just as Seth has done this, so this will happen to you, O bad disease. And then it calls it will ban you likewise, O Canaanite illness. We'll get back to that. You shall not intend to pass through the limbs of this person, born of this person. So that's the Hurst medical papyrus. But notice that the epidemic has been named after another on the outside who is not of the center of the community we're talking about. So it's like naming it the Spanish flu or the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus. And she remarks that this idea of calling it the Asiatic flu, Canaanite flu, is from Amu, the Egyptian word Amu. She has this is Ava, whose last name is, Panagiotakopoulou. And I love the way she said this. It's called a Canaanite or Amu illness, either because of the place in which it started or simply because everything deleterious tends to be blamed on somebody else. Perfectly said. Brilliant. She says the case of syphilis was Shakespeare's malady of France in the play Henry V. So there is another example of how the disease is always blamed on an outsider, on somebody else. She then continues to the London Medical Papyrus for another a description of the plague, the bubonic plague, we have to assume. When the body is coal black with charcoal spots, in addition to the water, that would be the urine, is a red liquid, i.e. bloody. Lovely. And then there's an Amarna letter. For those of you that know the time period of Akhenaten and the new capital city of Akhenaten, called Akhenaten, there were a collection of diplomatic letters found on the site from the 14th century. And we have one letter here from the king of Alasia, which may be Cyprus. And the king writes to Egypt to explain why he didn't send enough tribute, why he didn't send any gold. He says it's because the hand of the pestilence is now in his country, and it has killed all the men of his country, and there is not a single copper worker to help him get this material together as tribute. She mentions the plague prayers of Murshili II, Hittite king, and that the plague of the 14th century killed the Hittite king himself, Shupoluliuma. That's a fun king's name to say. And so that was a whole article about bubonic plague and whether or not it was in Amarna, because Tel Amarna, Akhenaten's capital city, may have actually been hit by this plague, and it may have struck the royal family itself and taken out some of Akhenaten's daughters. This is much debated. It is so debated that there are some Egyptologists who see the work coming out in the new cemeteries of the workmen as plague pits rather than graves that document the abuse of the workers who built the city of Tel El Amarna. I am more of the opinion that the people buried at Tel El Amarna like this show long-term problems of malnourishment, stress fractures, repetitive injuries, more severe acute injuries, but that these people were working for a long period of time, starving and wounded. I don't see that as, from the bioarchaeology and the bioarchaeologists I've talked to who are excavating in this area, I don't see those graves at Tel El Amarna as representative of plague pits. But there are other Egyptologists, namely Ray Johnson of the University of Chicago, who do see those as plague pits. I was reminded about an excavation by Francesco Tiradritti at ancient Thebes, modern-day Luxor, on the West Bank, because he found a plague pit. Can you imagine being an archaeologist who finds a plague pit? And it was at the tomb that he was working at, the late period tomb of Harwa, 26th dynasty tomb. And they found this pit of people covered in lime, burned and disposed of very quickly, all from the 3rd century AD or CE. And it comes from the well-known plague of Cyprian, a plague that supposedly killed 5,000 ancient Romans a day, that killed Roman emperors, and was pretty brutal. So there's that one, and I was reminded of that excavation. I would have been afraid to conduct that excavation, but Francesco is alive and well, and so we let that be. And before that, you might be reminded of something like the plague of Athens, 450 BCE, that killed so many people in Athens. And I found an article in my brief research that suggested that this could have been Ebola coming from Africa. The symptoms as described by the Athenians are similar to Ebola. Other people have described this in different terms, and there's always discussions about which plague is which. I don't know if I'm going to try to engage in those. I once put in my first trade book about Hatshepsut, the woman who would be king, mentions of, what disease did I say it was? Cholera. I said, oh, people could have died of cholera. And two specialists, one an Egyptological specialist and another a Romanist, wrote me separately and said, I can't believe you said cholera. Cholera, you don't see any evidence of it genetically until the 19th century. And I apologized. And in the paperback, I changed it to intestinal epidemic. So I'm like, okay, how's that? We good? And so that was okay. I don't pretend to understand all of these diseases, and I am not a doctor, and I don't even medical doctor, and I don't even play one on TV. But one last really interesting thing. Yeah, plague is, yeah, you're right. Plague is due to bacteria, living organism as opposed to viruses. True. The ancient Egyptians didn't know this. They're talking about epidemics in any way that they can. Um, yes, they give us, if they give us understandings of the symptoms, we can talk about which one it may have been. But the ancient Egyptians and ancient people as a whole couldn't necessarily differentiate between which ones were caused by viruses and which ones were caused by bacteria. That's for us to do in the modern world. For the ancient people, they just knew that, a third of the people in a city had died and that it was moving fast throughout the country, and word would spread from where this pestilence had come. And there's much disagreement amongst medical examiners of the ancient descriptions what the diagnoses of these different epidemics should be. So in general, we're just, I'm talking about epidemics as a whole. What does it mean when a virus or a bacteria sweep through a human population? What does it do to people? So that's what I'm interested in. One thing I found particularly intriguing, and I'm speaking out to the Egyptologists who are watching, and maybe you have some insight here, because this I found really perplexing. I was looking through, your standard Lichtheim and your William Kelly Simpson literature, looking through all of the ancient Egyptian literature, particularly at the pessimistic literature, admonitions of Ipuwer, prophecies of Neferti, Amenemope, all of these pieces of literature that talk about the world going to hell in a handbasket. Everything's horrible, everything's wrong, but a king comes in and saves the world. He comes in with his strong arm and his rule of law, and he puts everything to right. And there's no mention of an epidemic that I can find in any of them. There's no sickness sweeping the land. There's no pestilence. There's nothing that talks about a sickness given by the gods. In all of those, in that pessimistic literature, what we Egyptologists call pessimistic literature, where everything's like, oh my God, everything sucks, we need a strong leader, all of the things to be pessimistic about seem to be given by human beings. It's all at the hands of humans. Lays it all at the feet of human agency, which is pretty extraordinary, and talks about how people who should be poor have riches because they've stolen them. People who should be rich are laid bare and have nothing and are starving. And that the world is completely upside down, and people who bury things, those things are now being uncovered, and that the grain that should be stored is now just being eaten, and everyone just goes and grabs whatever they want. They call grain go get it, just go grab the grain. There's no rules of law about whose harvest is whose. You just go and take whatever you want. And it's a free-for-all. But it's a free-for-all in terms of human violence, civil war, brother acting against brother, warfare. There's no pestilence in this. So it's interesting to see that those pieces of pessimistic literature are pessimistic about what humans can do to each other and why a leader needs to intercede. But you don't, and they're politically created, those texts. I would argue that each and every one of those texts is created by a political leader to be the great hero, the great savior, the wartime president, if you will, coming in to save the day. But it's interesting to note how much more useful human-induced chaos is rather than pestilence or epidemics. Epidemics are, it seems, not good political fodder for Egyptian kings to come in and say, I save the day, because what the hell are they going to do? Whereas if they come in with their army or their rule of law, they actually can come in and say they save the day, whether it's actually true or not. Maybe it's deal making, who knows how they do it. But it's pretty interesting to see that you can't really use a pestilence in the same way politically, that it may be more debilitating long term. Well, now having said that, we are in a different age, right? As somebody just pointed out, we know the difference between bacterial epidemics and viral epidemics. We know what we can name it something. We have its structure. We know what breaks it down. We're working on a vaccine. It may take some time, but we can do these things. But it is interesting nonetheless to look around the world and see how leadership is shaped or has been shaped by this epidemic, and to look within my own country from state to state and to see how leadership has shaped or is shaped by or is shaping this epidemic. Because an epidemic can blow up in a state if the proper attention is not given or if the proper notice is not given. Or you could refuse to test and then nobody knows what the real numbers are. And then people might say, oh, nothing to see here for this pestilence, if you want to call it that, for this epidemic. I think that strategy could work. If you just refuse to test and you don't do it and it only kills a certain percentage of people, then you may be able to survive that politically. I'm not so sure. But let's see, right? All of this history is being written before our eyes. So if I'm obsessed with leadership, the presentation of idealism, a good fatherly leadership, authoritarian leadership, and how that rises up, how does an epidemic potentially help or hinder that leader? And it is of great interest that I don't see epidemics and pestilences mentioned in the traditional pessimistic literature. I'll have to look at the famine stela. I hadn't thought of that, but still it's a famine. That's talking about starvation brought on by a low Nile. That's not people dying because of a God-given disease. And of course, the ancient Egyptians would have seen it as God-given, whether it comes from the Asiatics or not. Yeah, exactly. Only 6 people have the kofefe. I like that. It's very true. So yeah, I'll read your comments and see what you guys have to say. But just those are my thoughts thus far on epidemics, plagues, pestilences. It's hard to do this research online because as soon as you put in the word plagues in Egypt, of course, you guys know where it's going to go. It's all 10 Commandments craziness. And if you can find scientific evidence for the, plague of blood and the frogs and the locusts and all this other stuff, which is not what I was looking for. But we'll end with that if we take the Hebrew narrative that emasculates Egyptian authoritarian kingship quite effectively, so effectively that we continue to give it credence to this day, and people rally around that narrative within their religious discourse, we can see that epidemics are not good for authoritarian power. They are one of the main means of exposing government that cannot rule effectively and that is based on exploitation, social inequality, cruelty even. And I'll leave you guys to discuss more. So enjoy your Thursdays. Tomorrow's Friday. I'm gonna work on some discussions of the third intermediate period. And actually doing this research was pretty cool because I have all kinds of ideas now about time periods of distress and crisis, and I'll start jumping back into some of my coffin reuse work because it's mentioned, it's all there. So I need to bring that out and bring that into my discussions of reuse. So that's what I'll try to work on today. Remember, if you have a hard task, set it first. Tell yourself you just have to spend 10 minutes on it, just 10 minutes, whatever it is, and then see how you feel after 10 minutes, and you might want to keep going. So that's my advice to you for all of us who feel unmotivated and are watching on Facebook as people brag about how much they're getting done, right? So, and you're like, I suck, I can't.